going to do today is a beginner Python workshop. So it's kind of made for anyone who hasn't really had experience coding before, or maybe just hasn't used Python before and kind of wanted to see how that kind of works. So that's kind of what we're trying to get at. And I think we kind of want you to register an account at REPL, because that's kind of what we're going to be using to teach it on. So if you're in the audience and you're watching right now, it'd be great if you could just quickly sign up an account at REPL while I talk about other stuff, and then we can get started after that. But just a quick introduction. I'm with the Bay Area Youth Computer Science Council, and essentially what we do is we kind of, sorry about this, someone, Sarah, I think you're, yeah, thank you. Yeah, so I'm part of the Bay Area Youth Computer Science Council, and what are one of our main goals is like increasing equity and diversity in computer science, and one of the main parts about that is introducing coding and programming to people who may not have had the right exposure yet. So that's kind of what we're doing through this. So just the basic topics we're going to go through in this workshop are, I guess, just the basics of Python, and through that we're going to kind of learn how to read a data file. So we're going to pull like information from a file and then kind of manipulate it and use it to do cool things. And we're going to learn user input and output. And this will kind of allow us to make a simple app with Python. Yeah, so that's all I have so far. So now we're going to take a look at some code. So one of the things, one sec. So here's just a link I'm just going to go to. It's pretty much what we're trying to make during this workshop. It's not too long. Essentially, I'm just going to try it actually. So it says this program lets you see the APCSA pass rates for any state in the United States. So it gives the user a prompt and asks what state, at which state you want to see the information. So I can just type in any state in the United States, and it'll kind of pop up the pass rates for this AP test across the years. And now, obviously, this is not a complete data set, but we just pulled something off the internet. So in this app, what it's doing is it's asking the user for any state, and then what it does, it kind of finds the information for us from this data file, and then it prints out the information in this nice little histogram. So I know that's a lot of things. Actually, that's like 3 things, and that's kind of a lot. So we're gonna break this down into piece by piece, and along the way, we're gonna kind of do an intro to Python. So yeah, so let me get out of this. So hopefully by now, if you're in the audience, if you're watching this, you have a REPL account, because it might be a little helpful to follow along as I do things, and kind of to just kind of follow along with the code I'm using. So here's a link to a REPL. Yeah, so I'm just gonna put this in the chat quickly. That's kind of the base code we're gonna start going off of. So yeah, if everyone, I guess, could go to this link. And if you're looking at this, there probably is a big like fork button right next to this big green run button. So if everyone could press that, that essentially just allows you to use the same code as I am. It just copies the code and makes your own copy of it. So that would be great if everyone can do that. And then on another note, there's 2 parts to this interface right here. On the left, you have all your code, and on the right, you have the console. So the console is essentially just the place where the code runs, and the computer spits out the output of what you want the program to do. So that might sound a little complicated, but that's just kind of how it works. So if you want to see what your program does, you always just press the run button. I think that's pretty intuitive. Wait one sec. Awesome. Okay. So right now we have this huge block of code. It might not make any sense. It probably doesn't make any sense at all. Yeah, it's doing some stuff, but we don't really know what it's doing either. So one thing, if I want to figure out what my program, if I want to figure out, yeah, sorry about that. If I want to figure out what my program is doing, one way we can do that is by asking the computer to show us what's going on. And one way we can do that is with something called a print statement. So if I just go down a couple lines and make sure I don't have any space in between, space on the left. If I just write print here, we can tell the computer, okay, we want you to kind of show us what's going on. And to be more specific, if you put parentheses next to the print statement, and you can put anything inside this print statement, it tells the computer, we want this to be printed out. So for example, if I just wanted like my name to be printed out, my name's Andrew, and I press run, the program will print out my name. So that's kind of how it works. But let's say I didn't want my name to be printed out. I wanted to figure out what's going on in this program. One thing I could do is, instead of my name, I would put this value called data. And what is data? Well, at the beginning of our program here, we have we made a new value and we call it data. And what we're doing in this program, I'll tell you, is we're kind of adding information to data. We're taking information from this we have this huge file right here, and we're putting it into this new variable called data. So if I print data, we can kind of see what's going on in this program. So if I print data, then there's this whole gobbledygook of information. And yeah, it's a lot of stuff. There's dates, there's numbers, and there's I guess there's states. There's a lot of stuff, but it's pretty cool because it kind of shows you what is my program doing so far. So if you haven't already, you might want to try that. But yeah, that's pretty much one of the first things you always want to do in Python. You want to kind of see, like, how can we make our computer spit something out? How can we see what's going on with this program? So the first thing I always do is print data, and then it'll print out this whole entire glob of information. But let's say I didn't want this whole entire information because it's a lot of stuff. There's like hundreds of lines of information here, and I don't really want to go through it all because, yeah, well, it's a lot of stuff. It's a lot of numbers and it's kind of random. So one thing we can do, if I want to be a little bit more specific and I want to pull data from maybe a specific state, for example, because we can see like the specific states right here, instead of printing just data, the one way we can be more specific is by putting little, what are these called? Brackets. So if you put a set of brackets next to data, and then inside those brackets in quotations, you put a certain state, we can get data specifically from the certain state. So let's just try New York. So if I ask the computer to print data from New York, we should get this specific set of data right here. So let's see if that works at all. Okay, sorry, 1 second, the Zoom window is annoying. Yeah, awesome. So now look here. So instead of getting this huge amount of information, the only thing the computer is printing is actually this little snippet of information, specifically from New York. So that's kind of how we can pull information directly from this data file. Now let's say I wanted to, one thing we can do with all this information is kind of organize it so we can kind of print it out a little bit easier. Because right now it's in this weird format where there's like brackets, there's these quotations, there's colons, there's commas, and it kind of doesn't make a lot of sense. So one thing we kind of want to do is print out this information so we can kind of see it easier. So one way I was thinking of we could do this is like is by doing like for each date. So at 2006, we could have data that says 91, and then on the next line it says 2007. It'd be like 85. So this looks a little bit better. Instead of being in this crazy bracket format and everything, we could have a new data point on each line. So that's what we're going to try to do. We're going to try making this look a little nicer so we can read it easier. Yeah, so let's get, so I'm going to actually start off with that. So far all we've done is we have this base program from before, and all we've done so far is just ask the computer to print a specific part of that data. And now, like I just said, we're going to try to make this data look a little nicer so we can actually do things with it. So the first thing we want to do is that we want to take every single date in this little data snippet right here, and then we want to print the date, but also print what its corresponding value is. And now I know that kind of sounds, that's kind of a lot. That's probably a little complicated if you just think about it, but there's actually, it's actually not too difficult. So we're going to learn about something called a for loop right now. And what's going to do is it's going to loop through every single, it's going to look at every single piece of information in this, what I call a dictionary, and it's going to kind of print out the information for you. So here we go. So it's going to be so for every date in this dictionary, which is data at New York, so you can just kind of copy and paste that right there. So what you're doing is you're pulling every single date from this dictionary, and then inside, once after you press enter and indent, so you kind of have this little space on the left, this kind of tells the computer that this is where you want to put the code for every single date. So that's just something to keep in mind. But for every single date, I guess, what do I want to do? I want to print the date. Oops, print the date. So we can kind of see what happens. So for every single date in this little data set, what can we do with it? What can we do with it? And in this case, I want to just print the date. Also, another note, actually, don't use date, use year, because date is a special keyword and you can't do that. So if you just ask the computer to print the year, let's see what happens. So basically we look at every single year in this data set, and then we ask the computer, okay, can you print the year? And look, so we get 2006, 2006, and then 2007, 2007, and it just prints every single year. So that's kind of a fancy way of going through this data. So that's kind of how we make it look a little bit nicer so far, and kind of pull data from this weird format into this little bit cleaner format. But right now we only have half the information. We're still missing the corresponding value. So that would be, in the case of 2006, it'd be 91 and 85 and 96. So how can we get the date, but how can we get the year, but also get this corresponding value? So one way to do that, or the easiest way to do that, is basically just we're going to want to print another thing, and this time we want the corresponding value. So we just do data at New York, but this time at the specific year you want to look at. So instead of just printing out the year, it prints out what the information is at that year. So hopefully if we try this, when we print it, yeah, see, so now it prints the corresponding value at every year. So that's kind of how we pull out our data out of this little gobbledygook, and kind of put it into a different format so we can use the information better. Just quick housekeeping quickly. I know I'm going through this kind of quickly. So if you ever have any questions over what I'm doing, just I feel free to put in the chat or something, or just unmute yourself and we can kind of see what your question is and see how I can help. Yeah, so this is what we have so far. So right now we take a certain bit of data out of our huge database. We go through every single year in this tiny snippet of data. We print the year, and then we also print the corresponding value. And one thing we can test is that since there are many states in our database, as you can see, there's like Alabama, California, New York. One thing we can test is, instead of New York, what happens if we replace New York with any other state? Let's try, I guess, Alabama. Why not? So if we replace every instance of New York with Alabama, we can kind of see how our program changes based on that. So if I replace New York with Alabama, it's still in a similar format, but instead of having the same the same data, it has a different amount of data, because the data for Alabama is different from the data from New York, of course. But since it's still printed out in the same format, we know that our program is working, which is a good sign. And yes, I am going to share actually, I think I popped the link in the chat, but yeah, I am going to share the code at the end so you guys can all see it and kind of modify it. But yeah, I'll do that in a bit. So for now, I guess just kind of follow along. So yeah, so far what we have is we take a little data, we print the year, and we print the corresponding value. And since we've tried another state, we know that our program can work for multiple states and not just New York, for example. So one thing I thought would be pretty cool is instead of having like just a static number like 5 or 6 or 7 or 10 or 17, we could kind of turn the corresponding value kind of into a histogram. So instead of just 5 here, we'd have 5 stars that line up horizontally to kind of represent the number 5 here. Or instead of 6, we'd have 6 stars. So we can kind of have this visual so we can better see what our data is looking like. Yeah, I can actually pull up a quick example. Like see in this example, instead of having the number 5 corresponding to 2008, we have 5 stars. So this kind of makes it look a little nicer and yeah, just a cool way to do things. So yeah, that is actually what we're going to try next. So one way we can do that is one sec, give me a minute. All right. Okay, so the way we're going to do that is we're going to say based on the number, the corresponding value, we want to print this amount of number of stars. So if it says 5, we want to print 5 stars to kind of represent that. If it says 6, we want to print 6 stars. So an easy way to do this is actually with another for loop. So right here, we used a for loop to go through every single year in the data, but you can also use for loops to go through to iterate over a search until you get to a certain number. So the way we do that is for x in range. X is just a number that keeps going up and keeps track of where you are. So for x in range, a certain number. And this certain number is the corresponding value because we always, if it says 5, we want to print 5 stars. So we're just going to copy what that is and put it into these parentheses. So what this is doing is that we're going to run the code we put inside here this many number of times, which is basically the corresponding value. And what this lets us do, so we're going to run this code this many number of times. But what do we want to do this many number of times? Well, we want to print stars that many number of times. So we can just do print and asterisk. So for this many number of times, we're going to print a star to represent that number. And let's just see what this does. Let's see what this does. Okay, so it's giving us a string object. Okay, so basically what this error means is that it's telling us that the number that we're putting into this parentheses right here, it's actually, it has to be a number and it cannot be a string. And the problem is because this, as you can see, sometimes the corresponding values are not always numbers. Sometimes they're asterisks if they don't have enough information. So one thing we have to do is kind of check. We have to check if we have a number, so then we can print stars. Because if we don't have a number and we have an asterisk, we don't want to print any stars. So one way we can do that is with something called an if statement. So an if statement basically checks if a condition is true, then run the following code. But if it's not true, don't run the following code. In this case, we only want we only want to run our for loop and print stars if it's not an asterisk. So the easy way to do that is just if our value, if the corresponding value is not equal to an asterisk, like that. So what basically this fancy exclamation point equal sign is, it basically just tells the computer if it's not equal to it. So if the value we have is not equal to an asterisk, colon, then we want to run the rest of this code. And then you can just copy and paste that and put it inside this if statement like that. So basically it's telling the computer, if the data value we have is actually a year and not this asterisk, then we can start running our code to print an asterisk. So let's try that again and see if it changes anything. Okay, so now it's actually the same error, but for a different reason actually this time. So it's still saying that the thing we're putting inside these parentheses is still a string. And the reason, and it needs an integer, but the reason it's a string is because if you look, let's look at our original data right here. You can tell that the numbers we have, they're inside quotation points, which means that it's not an integer, which is just a fancy way of saying it's not a number. It thinks it's a string, which is like letters and stuff. So one way we can change that quickly is by putting our value in an extra set of parentheses and then putting the keyword int in front of it, which basically tells the computer, okay, can you turn this into a number? And what this will do is it'll tell the computer turn into a number, and now see our program is working. So now it's printing a bunch of stars. So this kind of, since we can tell that 5 stars, I mean, if it says a number 5, that corresponds to 5 stars. If we say the number 10, for example, it corresponds to 10 stars. So we know, that's how we know that our program is running properly. But this kind of presentation is a little bit convoluted because you have, right here, we have kind of like this vertical presentation, but it kind of makes you have to scroll every time you want to look at a different number. So one way, if we, let's say we wanted to have and we want the stars to kind of go horizontally, one way we can do that is by making sure that all the stars print on the same line. So this might be a little bit confusing, but if you want to have all the stars go on the same line, a good way to do that is just in your print statement with your stars, you're going to want to put a comma after your asterisk, and then end equals just these empty quotations. So if you just copy that, and we can see what it does. But essentially what it does is it just makes sure that you don't go to a new line every time you print something. It'll just print everything on the same line. So now instead of having this long list of asterisks that are going vertically, we have them going horizontally. So that looks a little nicer. And let's see. Also, one more thing. You can see that this has caused like the date to kind of wrap around at the end too. One way we can fix that is just by putting an extra print statement out here, and this will just add a new line so it looks nicer. Awesome. So now we have the asterisks without a date at the end, and now they're flowing horizontally. And yeah, so that's kind of how our histogram is going to work. Let's see. And if we just wanted to clean up the presentation a little bit, so it's so it looks a little bit more like this, where you have the date and then the stars. One way we can do that, first of all, we want to get rid of the actual value, because we don't, now that we have 5 stars, we don't need to know that it's 5. We can just get rid of this value and we can delete that. So we can get rid of this data, this line of code on line 15, which is just asking to print the value. So we can get rid of that. And then we can kind of see what happened after that. What does our code look like now? Okay, it says it's loading. Awesome. Okay, so yeah, so by getting rid of that print statement, we kind of got rid of that extra number now that we don't need anymore. So that's good. Another thing, if we want the numbers, instead of going to the next line, we just want them to line up after the year, we can do the same trick we did before. We're going to use this comma end equals nothing, and we're going to kind of end that, add that to the end of our year. So instead of printing on a new line all the stars, it'll print it on the same line as the year. So let's try that, and look at that, it kind of worked. So now we have 2000, the year, and then the stars that correspond with it. So yeah, that looks a little bit better, except for this part up here. something happened up here where it's not printing a new line. So one way we can fix that is just by moving this print statement a couple spaces to the left, so it prints after every year. So like that. Now we have all the now we have the year correspond, and then the stars that correspond to it. So that looks a little better. So that's pretty much it for the first part of our program. This is just like taking the data, kind of looking through it, and then picking a certain part of the data and then printing out this data in this nice histogram. So I'm just going to, I guess you guys can, I'm just going to put this link in the chat. This is kind of the final part. This is kind of like the final code for the first part. You guys can check that out if you want to, or if you need to copy some things. So that's pretty much it for the first part. Is all I was trying to say. But the second part, to make this more like an app. So instead of having to, anytime I want to see a certain state, I have to replace every single instance of Alabama, for example, into a different state. So in order for me to see it. So if I wanted to see California, I'd have to replace every single time Alabama pops up and replace it to California, so I can see California's data. And that's kind of problematic because I don't really want to have to change the text in my code every time I want to see a different result. So yeah, and you can see, you can change it to any state you want. But one way, a good way, so we can kind of make this a little bit more interactive, so the person doesn't have to change the code every time they want a different result, is with input output. So essentially, this is kind of the second part. This is a little bit easier than what we've gone over so far, but we're gonna go use Python's input function, so we can kind of ask the user for a certain state, and then we'll find the information based on what the user puts in. So the user does not have to go into the code every single time and change the information there. They can just tell the program what they want it to do. So I'm gonna actually copy this link into the chat too. And this is just the basic, a basic demonstration of how input works in Python. So right now, let me just read what it says. It says this program lets you see APCSA pass rates for any state in the United States. Okay, so pick a state. It asks the user to pick a state. So I can pick California, for example, and then it'll print the data from California. And we can see how this works because in our we have a really small database in this case, in this data variable. And if I type in California, it pops out this exact set of data. So it asks the user, so let's say if I say I want Nevada instead, it'll pop up this exact set of data, which is pretty cool. So this kind of shows how we can ask the user for a certain piece of information, and then once the computer gets that certain piece of information, it goes back into the data and prints out the data that the user asked for. So essentially, what we're going to do is we're going to kind of copy all this code on the bottom right here, and we're going to kind of bring it to what we have so far, and then we're going to kind of see how we can combine the two things. So yeah, so feel free just to copy this big block of code and then go back to your original REPL, I guess. And then just, yeah, you can just paste it at the bottom so you can kind of see. Let's see. So let's just run our program right now and see what it does. So first, right now, it prints out the data for a certain state, and then at the bottom, the new stuff we just put in, it's asking the user to pick a state. Now, obviously, a pretty cool way to do this, instead of having it printing out the data before it asks the user, it'd be pretty helpful to ask the user which state they want before we print out the data. So one way we can do that is just by taking all of our all of our what's this called? All of our, so we can take the block of code that prints out kind of the information in this nice histogram, and we can put it into our existing user input right here. So if just feel free to copy and paste that whole block of code at the top, and then put it into this this area right here. So that you would just put it like right there. Why is it? All right, awesome. And another thing, you can also delete this whole portion of the program too, because we don't need it because that was from the other project. So feel free to delete these 4 lines at the top of this area. And yeah, so we're gonna kind of see what this does. So I'm just gonna go through it. So it's currently, first it asks while state, and what does while state mean? Well, outside of this little statement right here, we have something, we make a new variable called state. And what state does is it asks the user to type in a specific state. It asks the user for some information that it can then process. So when we say while state, it means while the user is still giving us information, and then we have all this code right here. On another note, there's a copy of this. There's this line of code that says state equals input, pick a state. It actually belongs at the bottom down here. So just quickly do that. So now we can kind of test what this does. So what it should do is it asks the user for a state, and then it prints that the information from that specific state. So let's just see what that does. So it asks the user for a state, and if I want New York, awesome. Okay, so now it prints the data for New York. But if I want, let's say I want to print California, did it not? So I asked the computer to print California, and it printed out some data, which is good. But this is also the same data for New York, which means that the program's not working properly because it printed out the same set of data for New York as California, which means we have to go back into our code and see why it's doing that. So as you can see right here, you can see how our code right now is printing only the data from New York, which is kind of a problem because we want it to be able to print whatever we want it to be able to print the data from whatever state the user asks for. So one way we can change this is instead of using New York, we just use the value that the user gave us. So in this case, it would be state because that's what is asking the user for the information. So anytime it says New York, you're going to want to replace that with the variable called state. And we can kind of see what this does. So instead of pulling data from New York every single time, it'll pull data from whatever state that that the user asks. So if I ask for New York, it'll print out the data from New York. And if I ask for, let's say, California, it'll print out a whole new data set. And let's try Alabama again. Yeah, so it prints out this different set of data. So we can kind of see how our program, so now it's kind of allowing the user to put in their input and then print out the correct data for whatever the user wants. So that's kind of the basics of how we can use input output and like asking the user things to build a basic app. So essentially what this, I guess you could say app, I guess what you could call an app, what this does is it asks the user for any state in the United States, and it says, okay, now I'm going to print the specific data for that state. And we can kind of see how it printed in this kind of histogram kind of format. But there's actually a lot more things you can do with it than just what we have so far. Because right now, our data is specifically for the AP Computer Science pass rates in different states in the United States. But if you wanted, you could instead make this about literally any topic in the world. Like you could make it about California wildfires. You could make it about, you could find data on the internet about computer, like the COVID-19 pandemic, and kind of replace the data file we have here with something about that. And in that way, you can kind of make your app about anything you want. So this is our program so far. Just if you are looking for a place to find information, like where we found this data file full of information for the APCSA pass rates, there's a website that I've used before. It's called Kaggle. Yeah, and it just has a lot of different topics and a lot of different data. But if you're looking to kind of customize your program and kind of find your own data sets, you can use this website and then just kind of download the files and just upload them into this little directory right here. So that's just a handy way of doing things. And if you're if you're interested in seeing, this is kind of what I envisioned the final project be. So if you're kind of interested in the code for that, I can quickly just copy the link for that too. So yeah, if you want the code for what we've done today, it's in that link right there. Let me make sure it works. Yeah, there you go. So it just has that, and then you can kind of test it yourself and then modify it any way you want. Yeah, so that's pretty much all I've had planned for this workshop. I mean, I think we went through that really quickly. If you had trouble following along, you can feel free to ask any questions right now. But yeah, that's all I had. All right. If no one has any questions about that, I think that's pretty much it then. I think oh wait. All right, yeah. Yeah. Thanks for listening, everyone.